Madison, can you see these slides?
It's loading. Oh, yes, now I can.
Great. Okay. Welcome, everybody, to Bonfire number 12. We are in our 12th week of the fellowship. That means we only have one more week after this week. We'll be talking a lot about the end of the fellowship tonight. But, we are winding down, but we're not going anywhere. We'll talk a little bit about how we have lots of programming coming up, even though the fellowship is technically ending next week. So tonight, we're going to talk about systems thinking again, and the iceberg diagram that we started last week. And the topic is going to be uncovering the structure of our democracy. We're going to start with actually some announcements tonight because these are so important that I didn't want to wait till the end. And we've got lots of questions about it, and there's a lot of info here. So let me just walk you through it. First thing is, some people have been asking what it means to be a builder. Being a builder just means someone who has completed the fellowship and is up building the Civics 2030 community. You are all on pace to do that if you're here tonight. The only requirement at the end of the fellowship will be to submit a pledge. You'll get all the info about submitting the pledge next week. It's not a huge project, not that time consuming, so you all should have no problem completing it. And once you've done that, you will be a pledge. We will be having a commencement style event for you in June. We don't have an exact date for it, but if you submit the pledge and you go to commencement, then you are officially a builder. What does it mean to be a builder? Well, there's all kinds of opportunities that it unlocks. And one of them is funding for projects. You can get up to $1,000 if you propose a civic project that is approved by our steering committee. The requirements are that it's nonpartisan, that it's civics related, which is can be stretched a little bit. So if you think you're worried if it doesn't fit under there, I would give it a shot to apply. It has to be a new-ish project. This can't be something you've built that's 5 years in already. This is meant for a new startup, and it needs to be led by CU fellows. If you want to do this with someone else in the fellowship, you definitely can. You don't have to do this by yourself. The deadline to apply is this Friday at midnight Eastern time, May 21st. If you are a recipient of this stipend, we will also be offering a trip to New York City where you get some project acceleration with the CU team from July 13th to July 15th. This is going to be an amazing experience. You're going to be part of an in-person experience when there have not been many in-person experiences due to COVID. If you talk to some of last year's CU fellows, they'll tell you that we were originally intending to all get together in DC. Last summer, we obviously couldn't do that due to COVID, but this summer we're going to have a small group of you in New York City, and it's going to be amazing. So if you're interested in this opportunity, the application link is here. Last year's project winners are here. And if you have more questions, you can talk to Zoe. Next, steering committee elections. So we have a steering committee, you might not know this, that is made up entirely of last year's CU fellows, 5 of them. The application to be on this year's steering committee is going to open next Monday and close a week later on June 1st. So if you want to run to be on this steering committee and help make the decisions about who gets next year's funding, as well as determine rules about how CU's steering committee is governed, then you should apply for this. You're going to be given the opportunity to participate in supplemental daily reflections on Slack called Candidate Reflections, which will help your peers determine if they should vote for you to be on the steering committee. The election itself will take place June 7th. And again, just like the recipients of the project stipend, you will also be invited to New York City to meet the CU team and to work with last year's steering committee if you are elected this year. So again, a huge, huge opportunity for a great in-person experience with us in NYC. So please, if you're interested, make sure you submit that steering committee application. We'll have more info for you on that next week. If you have questions, you can talk to Jonah on Slack or click on this link when I send you the slides. Awesome. So, and if you have questions about the steering committee, just hold them till the end, or you can put them in the Q&A chat right now, and I'll try to answer them. But the main person who's running the elections is going to be Jonah. Oh, and there are ranked choice voting elections too. I'm sorry I didn't mention that earlier, but Jonah, the election administrator, has decided to use ranked choice voting. So that's what we're going to go with. And I'll turn it over to Madison. Sorry, Madison, I didn't introduce you before. I feel really bad. Welcome back. You've done bonfires here before, so everybody should know you. But we're really lucky to have you here tonight.
Yeah, it's great to be back, and I'm super excited for that July trip. I will be there, and I am really excited to meet some of last year's fellows and some of you as well. And so for today's lesson, we're going to do a refresher on the iceberg diagram that Nick introduced in the last bonfire. And then we're going to talk about causal feedback loops and how they can help us uncover the third layer of the iceberg. And then we are going to use voter turnout data to understand the iceberg. And as always, we'll have a Q&A and breakout hangout afterwards.
To recap, last time we started the iceberg diagram and we just looked at the first two pieces where events, which are at the tip of the iceberg above the surface. Those are the things we see on a daily basis in the news. And then below that, just below the surface, are the patterns of behavior. And we looked at some patterns of behavior. Today, we're going to be looking at the next level, which is the structure of the system. So here again is the diagram. The more you see this, the more comfortable you get with it. I know the first time you look at it, you're like, whoa, what is this? This is so much information thrown at me. But it's actually pretty simple. You can even, for a second, just ignore what's on the right-hand side and just look at the iceberg itself. So like I said, events at the top, right below that are the patterns of behavior. We use behavior over time graphs to look back at those, look back through history. And then tonight, we're going to look at the structure of the system, how everything fits together. And then finally, our last lesson next week is going to focus on mental mottos, those deep-seated beliefs. That's at the very, very bottom, below the surface. And those are the hardest things to change, but they're necessary to bring to the surface if we want to make any changes in our systems.
Okay, and to frame up this lesson, we're going to start with a question. So think of an example of a causal relationship you have observed at home, school, or in the outside world. It can be personal or about something larger than yourself. And FYI, causal just means cause and effect. So as an example, I've noticed the more that I actually relax on the weekends, the more productive I am during the week. And quick disclaimer for those of you who are statistics scholars, don't worry that we don't have randomized control trials to prove these causal relationships. It's okay for it to just be anecdotal. So go ahead and drop your examples in the Slack chat. Me and my parents tend to get more upset with each other if the other is upset. Yeah, that can definitely be a vicious cycle. The more I move around and do things throughout the day, the more productive and content I feel. Yep. Do you see that one, Nick? The longer I nap, the more awesome I get.
Yeah, that's a good one. I get angsty when I eat dinner later, irritating more and more people. Yeah, that seems like a classic vicious cycle.
Mm-hmm. The more I procrastinate, the more stressed I am. Yeah, a lot of times you procrastinate because you want to relax, but it ends up being worse in the long run because you have more stress. The more I work and overload my schedule, the more I will get sick because my body needs a break. Yeah, the more I listen to music, the more I get productive and feel good about myself. Yep, a lot of people like music, and that correlates to productivity. The longer I stare at the fellowship Slack, the more insane I get. Oh, I like this one. The more precise my to-do list is, the more motivated I am to complete tasks. Yeah, I used to be someone who really followed to-do lists and helped a lot.
I like Ashton's, obviously.
Oh, Adam, I have realized that too. The more time you have, the less productive you are. Like I went through a time when I had like so much time during the week and I wouldn't even like clean my room. It's just so weird how having a schedule helps like that. The more I talk to my friends, the less I want to talk to my friends. Um, the more steps I get done in exercise goals, the more accomplished I feel. Awesome. These are all great examples.
They are. Yeah, I like the more that I exercise, the more energetic I feel. Most people think the opposite. Oh, if I exercise, I'll be tired. I won't have the energy to do anything extra. But it does energize you in the long run. So it definitely helps with, like, for instance, studying or researching something.
Yep.
Okay, So today we're going to be looking at causal relationships, just like the ones that you said, to try and answer the questions at the third level of the iceberg, the structure of the system. And so the questions that we're trying to ask are, questions we're trying to answer are, what parts of a system are creating the patterns of behavior we saw last time in our graphs? And then what are the relationships among these parts in the system? By examining these causal connections between these parts in the system, we can hopefully identify which parts of the system we can intervene in. And I know this might sound abstract right now. We're going to give you plenty of examples of this in a minute. And so to put this another way, behind each pattern of behavior we see, like last week, I gave you an example of a pattern of behavior of the freshman enrollment at my old school fluctuating up and down, or maybe voter turnout in the US. Those are both patterns of behavior. Behind those is a systemic structure. And this is a set of seemingly unrelated factors that interact, even though they might be separated in time and place, and even though their relationships are hard to recognize. So we don't immediately see it. That's again why this is an iceberg. You don't see what's below the surface. You don't see these systemic structures every day. You need to look harder for it. And by looking at these systemic structures, we can find what are called the leverage points, or the points of leverage. And this is really important to figuring out how to intervene in the system, to find that leverage point. We must remember, though, that the leverage points are not always the places of quote unquote highest authority. So they're not always the school board, they're not always the mayor's office, the governor, or even the president of the US. It's not always the best to go to those people first, or to those parts of the system first. The leverage points are the places where the deep-seated dynamics of cause and effect are most susceptible to change. And this means that the place we want to intervene in could be much less publicly visible. It might not be the mayor's office or the governor's office, and not necessarily the most powerful. So think maybe much smaller, maybe like the individual classroom in a school or the lunchroom, as opposed to going all the way to the mayor's office if you want to make change.
And on that note, many of the systems that you care about, so your school, place of worship, local government, our democracy, and so many more, have developed over time as a result of repeatedly taking the same approach to chronic problems, like the enrollment at Nick's school that he mentioned in the last bonfire, or even CU. So if we want to redesign the system to function more efficiently, we need to understand the existing structures and practices. And one way to do this is to map the system by creating what is called a causal feedback loop. And Nick is going to introduce an example of a simple feedback loop.
Okay, so take a look at this. This is super, super simple causal feedback loop. And this describes a lot of scenarios where you're practicing something. So what it says is, in the orange box here at the top left, is if you spend a lot of time practicing free throws, playing basketball, practicing, that's what the plus sign means, that you're doing something greater. If you spend a lot of time doing that, then that's going to increase your skill level, right? Makes sense. You practice something, you get more skilled at it. That's also going to increase your enjoyment of playing basketball, right? We all like to do things that we're good at, right? And not many of us want to spend hours and hours doing something we're terrible at. Once we get good at something, we usually enjoy it a little bit more. And then that's in turn going to make you want to practice more free throws again, because you had that enjoyment. So you'll get out there. Now, you could use this for any sport. You could use this for any subject that you're studying. Lots and lots of examples. And this is an example of a positive causal feedback loop. Super, super simple. It's important to note, though, that many causal feedback loops that we present to you are an ideal scenario. They're exactly how we want a system to behave. So in that basketball example, that's ideally the perfect scenario. And sometimes we don't fit into that. In reality, no system is going to function perfectly. There's going to be all kinds of factors that prevent the system from achieving this ideal functioning. Like maybe you can only play outside and it rains. Maybe you live in a cold weather city where you can't get out enough to play. Could be all kinds of impediments that prevent this system from functioning properly.
Yep, so ideal scenarios are only so helpful in understanding our complex realities. So let's think about a real world example for this. For instance, our education system. So answer in the Slack, what are some things you think are preventing us from better educating young people? Prejudices, yep, Money is a huge one. Teachers not getting paid adequately, not having enough money to, create good classroom environments. That is huge. Old ideas that are holding us back and that don't allow us to evolve alongside emerging technologies and ideas. Ooh, Jahi, quantitative metrics. That's great. I mean, we're seeing the rise of people not valuing that as much, with standardized tests becoming optional or certain colleges going test blind. People in power.
Rote learning. Yeah, teaching kids not how to think, but just teaching them what to think. That's really bad. Just having them memorize facts.
The early start time of school. There are so many little things like that could go on to affect the way the entire education system works, that are really important to look at, and that are things that you can't account for in a simple example like the basketball example.
De facto segregation. That's another good one. Yeah, there's a lot of evidence that our school systems are just as segregated as they were before Brown versus the board now, and it's obviously not any legal reason. It's de facto, which is much harder to combat.
Anna says textbook biases. Yes, because textbooks are seen as like the standard of knowledge, especially for young, impressionable people. So that is a huge problem as well. Lack of modernization, never changing the teaching methods throughout the years.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I like Mary's answer to the no child left behind mindset. You could do years of research into no child left behind and the Bush administration's policies, followed by Obama administration's policies, and what that did to K through 12 education that we're still living in right now.
Ella says less focus on mental health. That's a great example of when cutting corners may be helpful in the short term for resources or time, but could actually really end up harming the system in the long term.
Teach you to the test. Yeah, these are fantastic responses.
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks for those responses. We looked at a pretty simple causal feedback loop with the basketball example, but now I want to turn to a more complex feedback loop. And I want to look at something that's way more critical to our democracy than basketball, although I do love basketball, which is our elections and voter turnout. So first, before we get to the causal feedback loop, let's look at a behavior over time graph. Remember, the behavior over time graph is at the level that's just below the surface, right? This is patterns of behavior over time. And so this is the turnout in presidential and midterm elections in the US, going all the way back to the beginning, 1789, when our Constitution was enacted. And you can see the title of this graph is highest turnout rate since 1900. That is our turnout rate in the 2020 presidential election. It was actually higher last November than any election going since 1900, which is pretty impressive in 120 years. And we can see that there were some pretty big dips in our presidential election turnout after the 1960s. And it fluctuated a little bit between 50 and 60%, but we were up almost over 70% in this election. If you look back even further, pre-1900, the turnout was really, really high. And it's important to note that this is turnout of the voting eligible population. That's what VEP stands for, voting eligible population. So for instance, in 1880, women didn't have the right to vote yet. So maybe that's why the VEP was higher here. In 1920, when women did have the right to vote, we have a larger voting eligible population. And so maybe that's a reason why the turnout rate went down. It doesn't mean that women weren't voting. It just means that it opened up a whole new block of people to vote. And so the expected turnout versus who actually turned out reduced a little bit. So lots of good data in here. I'm going to pause for just a second to see if anybody has any comments in Slack about this. Madison, have you seen anyone ask any questions in here?
It looks like Adam was asking a question. What happened after 1900 Theodore Roosevelt?
Oh, in terms of the turnout rate, the decline here, I think, is because of the 19th Amendment, just opening up a whole new set of people to vote. Similar thing happened in 1980 when the voting age dropped from 21 to 18, the 27th Amendment or 26th Amendment. That again increased the eligible voters, and so that then decreases the turnout rate. It's kind of a paradox, but that's why it decreased.
Yeah, and Roman brought up a great point. He said that high turnout rates can indicate that voting rights are restricted, like you mentioned, or government is really failing. And I think that's an example of what happened in 2020. A lot of people were perceiving this as like a very, very important election. And so it incentivized people to vote more.
Great point. Some people say that a lower turnout rate is actually a sign of a healthy democracy, right? Because people are satisfied. It's not life or death. There are countries like my homeland of Greece where the voter turnout rate is over 90% in most elections because the country is struggling so much. And it's not a good sign, right? And so thank you, Roman, for bringing that up. That again can be very controversial. We don't want to suppress voter turnout, but if naturally the voter turnout falls at around 50%, some people say that's a good thing. Shows that people can live their lives and not worry about each election deciding the future of democracy.
Yeah, and another point to bring up on that is I know in Australia they have fines for if you don't vote. So obviously their voter turnout rate is very high, but anecdotally what I've heard is that people don't care as much about elections and that they're not necessarily making informed votes. So voter turnout rate isn't always the most informative or best statistic to look at.
Great point. Okay, so the question is, we have all this data here from this behavior over time graph. What's causing these fluctuations? And how does our electoral system actually function? To see that, we need to look at the structure of the system. And that's the next level down in the iceberg, through what we just saw before in the basketball example is called a causal feedback loop, sometimes called a systems map. So here's an attempt at a causal feedback loop of our electoral system. And I know, again, when you first see these maps, they jump out at you. They're like, what is this? This is so confusing. So many arrows, so many circles everywhere. I have no idea how to even start with this. What I do is I'll just pick any circle to start with. It doesn't matter because they're all interrelated. And so, for instance, I'll start with the top left, effective election administration. Actually, I'll start at the bottom left here, politically motivated election policy. What this means is that politicians are deciding how elections are run based on their own political motives. So there's been lots of people that have said in the US right now, we are deciding how elections are run based on political motivations and not based on what's best for democracy. And so what this systems map is saying, you can see the plus and minus signs, is that the more politically motivated election policy we have, then the less effective election administration we have, right? It makes sense. If politicians are hamstringing what election officials can do, then they're not going to be able to effectively administer an election. What that next means is if we have low effective election administration, then we have low trust in the elections by the public. If we have low trust in these elections by the public, then we have less people who turn out to vote. And what that does is puts pressure on election officials to make changes to election policy, which is what's going on in the US right now. And then, but what that does is then increases political motivation within election policy, which then again repeats the same cycle. And so we're kind of stuck in this feedback loop that we see ourselves in the US right now, where we have lots of political pressure about changing our elections that are resulting in poorly run elections. Some of you might say that this actually increases voter turnout and doesn't decrease it, which I could understand that argument. I think in the long run, though, these voter suppression efforts are going to reduce voter turnout because people might just not be eligible to vote anymore. I'm interested to hear if anybody has comments on this. Have you seen anything, Madison? Comments or questions on it?
Yeah, I think, let me look real quick. I think they're talking about the mandating voting with a fee.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. So the main takeaway from this is that it's a very, very complex, these electoral systems. And the only way to really see what's going on is to map them out. Now, if you really want to map it out, this is the full electoral system. Super, super complex. We were just looking at the core story, those 5 circles in the middle. But if you want to see the whole thing, we have a link for you at the end where you can see the website where this is located. But it's way more complex than even just that short story that I gave you.
What's
Okay.
interesting is that, yeah, I mean, you can't even map everything out, right? You could spend your whole life trying to map out how everything is included in a feedback loop like that, and it would be impossible. Just everything's so interconnected.
Exactly, and people do, right? This is what a political scientist who studies voter turnout or elections does, right? This is their career is just doing this map and continuing to refine it and explain it and try to figure out what's best for our democracy.
Mhm.
Now, that map's complexity, though, was not meant to deter any of you from trying to understand and find the leverage points in our electoral system or any system. But instead, it's meant to inspire you that, yes, we can better understand these systems. Even though they've been around for hundreds of years, we can improve them. We are not resigned to the fate of just letting these systems operate as they are. So if you're an individual and you want to increase voter turnout, there are many points of leverage at your local level. You can canvass, you can join nonpartisan get out the vote drives, or you can try something completely different that no one has thought of before. That's the beauty of it. And maybe you will be the person who looks at a systems map like this and figures out a better way to intervene and a better leverage point.
All right, so a couple points to keep in mind as we wrap up. You can apply these tools to any system or issue that interests you. It can be in your school, community, friend group, whatever it is. And there are already organizations doing this kind of work that would love young people as smart, passionate, dedicated, and awesome as you all to join their teams. And lastly, remember that a major objective of the fellowship is for you to figure out where your U shaped hole in the world is and plug in. And creating and examining these maps is a great way for you to find that U shaped hole.
Okay, just as another reminder, this is what the iceberg looks like. We today talked about the structure of the system, this 3rd level, and next week we're going to be wrapping up with mental models.
Okay, and so for this week's weekly quest, we have one, but we also have some optional ones as well if you really enjoyed this lesson. So, first is a possible selves exercise that will help you determine what roles you want to play in your future life. And this really closely relates to the concept of your U shaped hole and will help you explore many different possibilities. And then the first optional one is you can try to create your own causal feedback loop for a system that you're interested in. It can be as simple as the basketball example or as complex as the election example, although that may take some time. And we will send out the link to the slides after this so you can look back at those examples. And you can also message Nick if you'd like any extra help. And then another optional one is you can dive deeper into the world of systems mapping and democracy by checking out the website of the Democracy Fund, which is actually where that causal feedback loop diagram came from, and particularly their maps about politics and journalism, Congress, and elections.
Great. So just one announcement, since we had so many before the bonfire started, the Saturday Hangout this week is a movie night. Darielle has already posted about it in Slack. But if you have any questions about it, you can ask him. 7 p.m. Eastern Time this Saturday. Recommendation of the week. It's an article in a magazine and website called Wired that normally does tech stuff, but they had a really good article that I read today that was about this old scientific study from 60 years ago that the WHO and the CDC and many other health organizations relied on in the early days of COVID that actually ended up really harming us. And it's a cautionary tale about systems because it shows that epidemiologists who normally study these things were unwilling to listen to other kinds of scientists, including physicists, who would figure out how COVID spread. It was actually physicists who were the first people to understand that COVID was a respiratory disease that spread in the air rather than a traditional flu-like disease that spread through surfaces. And if these epidemiologists had listened to physicists much earlier instead of relying on these old studies, they would have recommended mask wearing much earlier, and it probably could have saved thousands and thousands of lives. So really good story. If you're interested in looking at how scientists could have done better with COVID. Finally, schedule reminder. Next week is our last bonfire and the last week of our Juntos. There are no bonfires and no Juntos after Memorial Day weekend. We will, though, be having a commencement event for you in June. Date TBD. We'll probably get that to you next week. And we're going to be having summer programming. So don't worry, we're not going anywhere. I'll still be doing Nick's New Knowledges. Gary will still be running sessions. We'll still be having treks. We'll still be having hangouts. Lots and lots of programming coming your way this summer, even though the fellowship is technically ending. And with that, let's do some Q&A. Put your questions in Zoom, please.
Awesome. And we already have one from Adam, and he asked, how many people will be allowed on this steering committee? So I know that last year we had 5, and Nick, just to confirm, it's still 5 again, right?
It is. It is still 5.
Yep, so 5 people. If I plan on moving out of the state or country for college just to live in, how long should I do mail-in voting for the state where my parents live? Or should I at all? Nick, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you can. I'd recommend. I mean, look, you can decide where your vote matters the most. Obviously, if you move to another country, you can't vote in a different state. But if you move to a different state, you could decide to vote in that state, right? And if you think your vote will matter more if you're in a swing state, like let's say you live in Massachusetts and you're moving to Ohio, yeah, obviously your vote's going to count more in Ohio if you want to decide the presidential election. So you can vote there. Or if you care more about local politics and you care more about what's going on back home in your hometown, then do an absentee ballot and vote there. But definitely do vote by mail.
Awesome. Brendan asks, could you elaborate upon the differences between being a builder and being on the steering committee? Yeah, so a builder is anyone who graduates from the fellowship and completes their pledge. And so once you are a builder, you are eligible to run for the steering committee. So the people on steering committee are still builders. It's kind of our word for alumni, for fellowship alumni. Natalie asks, is Nick's new knowledge going to continue? Nick, I'll let you answer that.
Yes, it will. Probably every 2 to 3 weeks during the summer. I'm not going to inundate you with lessons during the summer. We'll do them as interesting stuff comes up, and then in the fall we'll definitely ramp them up even more, especially as the Supreme Court starts their fall term. There's going to be lots and lots of interesting cases, and we'll take a look at those and get you prepared if you want to listen to those cases.
All right. Roman says, for steering committee, do we apply and then campaign to get elected, or is there no application form? So I know that there is a campaign period where you will be doing several things, but I'll let Nick give you more details on what that exactly looks like.
Yeah, good question, Roman. So you do apply, but it's not anyone who applies and fills out the form will be allowed to run for the steering committee. You're just answering some questions to help your fellows better understand what your candidacy is all about. So you will apply, and then there will be a campaign period. Jonah will have all the details for you. I'll put the link to all the details when I send out my recap email tonight.
All right, next question. What is a way we can get civic education into our schools? My first instinct to that question is getting involved in both local and state politics. I know that there's a lot of emphasis on national politics and national issues, but for things like civic education, it's really important that you let your representatives know what is most important to you and how that can be changed on the state and local level. But Nick, what else do you think for that?
I mean, that's the $1 million question in this area. There's lots of funding and lots of groups trying to figure out how to get more civics education into schools. One of the reasons that we developed CU was because we realized that some schools just weren't weren't cutting it. And so we wanted to go outside of schools and do things another way and not be reliant on the kind of bureaucracy that can weigh you down when you try to go into schools to do it. I do agree, though, that there needs to be way more in schools, but I'm not sure that a federal mandate is the way to do it. We have tried that, and it hasn't really been much of a success. So there might be some other avenues, but that's a great area to map out, right? Like, why have there been so many failures with civics education in schools? That you can look back through history at that and then try to develop an answer to that.
Okay, next question is, who would be my fellow colleagues on the steering committee? So the steering committee is 5 people, and the people who were on the steering committee last year and fellows from last year can also run for the steering committee. I'm actually not sure if any of the current steering committee members are going to run again, but maybe at least 1 or 2. And then, of course, anyone from the fellowship this year can also run. And it all just depends on which of those 5 people get elected. All right, what will our pledges likely contain? So the pledge is a pretty short form where you detail, I'm trying to remember all of the questions. I know for sure that it asks you about like what your ideal democracy looks like and kind of your plans for what you want to do after the fellowship. Nick, do you remember more specifically what was on there?
Yeah, the pledge that we're going to be sending you is a little bit different than last year's pledge. Its main component is how you can contribute to the CU community going forward, and it asks you kind of to identify your superpowers. But you'll get all the info of it next week.
And can they request bills to be looked at in Nick's new knowledge sessions?
Yes, you can just Slack me any recommendations you have. Disclaimer is I might not do it, but I'm always willing to hear recommendations for the sessions.
Adam has another steering committee question. Can you drop out and endorse candidates? Also, can I run polls on the steering committee elections? So obviously, if you do not want to be in the steering committee and you start running, you don't have to continue. We're not going to force you to continue, so you can drop out. Endorse candidates. I mean, I
think you can.
Yeah, I was like, I mean, if you're like, I think this person should be on the steering committee. I mean, of course, you can just say it in the Slack or do whatever you think to endorse, as long as it's not like smearing other people. And can I run polls on the steering committee elections? I think that would be fine. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm gonna say hold off on the polling until you ask Jonah about that. He sits on the steering committee now, and he's been voted by them to be the election administrator. So just ask Jonah if Gary says no polling. LOL. I mean, I don't know. I'm not gonna say no just yet. I'm gonna go through the proper channels and let Jonah decide that.
Another thing to take into consideration is that like it depends on what poll you're using. We're using ranked choice voting for the election, so
yeah, it would be hard, and it's a very short window too. It's only about 2 weeks from the application period to the election date, and you might not get a full random sample. So I don't know. We'll see.
Okay. What are your opinions on pre-registering to vote for teens and whether it's an effective leverage point to increasing civic participation and knowledge? What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, that's an interesting proposal. I'm not opposed to trying those things. HR. If you attended the Next New Knowledge on HR1, we talked a lot about the voting regs in the bill, and they're really meant to make voting registration so simple that everybody's basically registered. You almost have to opt out. You have to tell people that you don't want to be registered to vote, which most people won't do because they're just not going to take that effort. So if you're talking about pre-registering teens, then yeah, I think it's similar to what's in HR1 about just having everybody registered already.
All right, the next question is, are there term limits to the steering committee? Yes, the term limits are 2 years.
I think actually, Madison, I think they might have made an amendment and dropped it down to 1. I'm not sure on that. So it's either 1 or 2 years, but there are term limits, definitely.
Okay. Is there a 2-point takeaway you'd like us to have for this lesson? I didn't see the slides.
Yeah. 2 points to take away are, if you want to fully examine a system, you need to look below even the behavior over time and look at the structure of the system. And the reason you do that, second point, is that when you look at the structure of the system, you can find the leverage point for you to intervene in. Sorry that was not included in the slides, but those would be my 2 takeaways.
And then Dariel says, any future steering committee questions, please ask Dariel, an actual committee member, at post Bonfire Hangout.
Wow, that seems like some low key shade, as Dariel might say, at my answers about the steering committee. So please ask Dariel more questions about the steering committee.
Dariel said they know their stuff, just not steering stuff.
Yeah. Thanks, Dariel.
All right. Are we going to do anything over the summer? If so, how can fellows help? Yeah, so we'll be continuing a lot of the same programming, just not as frequently. For example, Saturday Hangouts, by virtue of the name, is every single Saturday, but those won't be happening every week. And I'm always looking for help on those. So if you want to host one, you can message me. You can even come up with your own idea. I know that Nick is going to be doing Nick's New Knowledge. Gary might have a couple sessions, and we'll just be introducing a couple of new series as well.
Great. Any other questions before we go?
How can we hold a position like Nora, Madison, and Mariam next year, helping to lead bonfires and other events? So the position that we are in wasn't anything like a formal application process. We were just really engaged with the CU community after the fellowship ended. So if you would want to help in that role, if maybe it's not necessarily the steering committee in that elected position, or even if you don't want to create a project, there are still going to be many ways that you can stay engaged with the community and potentially even be a guide next year or help in other ways. Will there be a Civics Unplugged summer camp? No, we decided to not do one this year because we know that a lot of people are zoomed out from school, and that it would be very different to do it this year as opposed to last year, because obviously last year everyone was stuck inside and didn't really have an option, and that was the whole reason why the summer camp was created. So we thought that it wouldn't make as much sense to have it when it's a completely different dynamic this summer.
Yeah, and we're still going to have summer programming, like I said, but it just won't be in the form of a camp. You're not missing anything by not going to camp. Some of the campers are in this fellowship, and they can tell you that it was similar to the fellowship. So if you've already done the fellowship, you probably wouldn't have done summer camp anyway.
Yep. All right, I think that's all the questions.
That's it. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining tonight. We will see you here next week for our final bonfire of our 2021 Spring Fellowship. Can't wait to see you all then. Thanks, Madison.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and thank you all. See you later.
See you, everybody.
Bye.